Everybody, and welcome to the weekly message for The Table. The Table is a church in Davenport, Iowa, where people are moving from greed toward generosity, from violence toward peacemaking, from isolation toward neighborliness, and from fear toward faith. I'm Pastor Rob Leverage, and it is good to be with you on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. Our gospel text for today is a pretty well, it's not the most well-known parable, but I think it's pretty well-known. It's the parable of the mustard seed. It's very brief, but there's a lot going on in these very few words. So let's open our hearts, open our ears, and give a good listen. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So the parable of the mustard seed is quite important to the New Testament's telling of the Jesus story. Some of the better known parables, such as maybe the parable of the Good Samaritan, they only appear in one of the four Gospels in the New Testament. The Good Samaritan is in Luke and only Luke. But the parable of the mustard seed appears in three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there are a little bit some differences in the way the story is told if you want to look them up and compare the way they appear in the different Gospels. But just now what we read comes from the Gospel of Matthew. And if you keep on reading the Gospel of Matthew, a few chapters later, Jesus refers to the mustard seed again. And he talks about having the faith of a mustard seed, which is a faith strong enough to move mountains. So the mustard seed is important. Okay. One essential message of the parable is very simple, so simple that you might take it for granted. The wisdom that small things become big. So don't dismiss something just because it's small, just because it's meek, because it really might be the beginning of something truly extraordinary. Small things become big. Okay. Now, interestingly, I've heard some people dispute the details of this story, sort of like fact-checking Jesus as he tells this parable. Sometimes people take issue with a couple of the claims made in this little parable. Apparently, mustard seeds are not the smallest seeds in the world. There are some that are smaller. Apparently, orchid seeds are smaller than mustard seeds. But more significant, I don't know why that matters actually, but more significantly, a full-grown mustard plant is typically not that huge. The plants that produce the mustard that we consume in the United States, those plants grow in Canada and New England. They don't grow in the Middle East where Jesus lived. But those mustard plants that are native to like New England, they tend to grow to about 2 feet tall. Now there are in Israel there's a lot of mustard plants in Israel that are even smaller, maybe even growing to 12 inches tall or something like that. But there is one kind of mustard plant, I don't know how to say the name, but it's the Brassica nigra, the black mustard, which some Bible scholars think is the kind of mustard plant that Jesus is talking about. And in the right conditions, not always, but in the right conditions, that kind of mustard plant can grow to be 6 feet tall, maybe even 8 feet, which, if that is a tree, it is a modest tree, but hey, I think we should look at it a different way. There's a promotional video for French's Mustard. It is on YouTube. I watched it. I find that to be a highly authoritative source of information. And French's Mustard says that to make one bottle of French's Mustard, it uses 10 million mustard seeds. So even if they're not the smallest seed in the world, they're small. And even if the plant is not the biggest plant in the world, it's pretty big for something that starts so small. And this is the lesson. Small things get big. That's an easy concept for us to take on board. But, you know, that cannot be the entire point of this parable. And in fact, I would contend that the growth that this parable describes really is not the thing in and of itself. It is not the thing that makes a mustard seed like the kingdom of God. Because, you know, it gets small. It starts out small and it gets bigger. And, you know, there are a lot of things that start small and get really big that are not good things. Things that you would not compare to the kingdom of God. Cancer starts small, gets big. Forest fires start small. Sometimes violence is instigated with small things and it escalates to be all-consuming. COVID-19 was a little thing at first. So the fact that it starts small and becomes big isn't really what makes the kingdom of God like a mustard seed, or the mustard seed like the kingdom of God. To really understand the comparison that Jesus is making in the parable, we actually need to think about the purpose of the seed that grows into the plant in this parable. Because after all, Jesus says that the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed that a person planted in his field. So this is not a wild plant that is just, growing out in nature. And it's also not an invasive weed that's like interfering with the crop growing of the farmer. I've actually heard some people have that kind of take, to this story in the Bible, that the mustard plant is an unwanted plant. But that just is not the case, because the parable describes a farmer or a gardener who is intentionally growing mustard as a crop. It was planted for a reason. So if we think about why the mustard is grown, what is the point of growing this mustard plant? What is it good for? Then we can perceive a little bit more about what Jesus is teaching about the kingdom of God in this parable. Well, first things first, mustard is a food. It is good for eating. And now I'm talking about the plant itself. The leaves, right? Mustard greens make good salad greens, but also many different types of mustard plant. The stalks can be harvested and eaten like broccoli, similar to the way broccoli is harvested, okay? So, and then of course, the most common way that we think of mustard is the mustard seed, which it can be ground up, used as a spice, as an ingredient, or made into a paste with vinegar and put on foods like French's mustard on a hot dog. I did not know this or have cause to think about this, but people have been using mustard as a condiment specifically since before the time of Jesus. People have been putting mustard on their food for thousands of years. Okay, so the people have known that mustard plants make good eating for a long, long time. And this awareness of the mustard plant as an edible vegetable, this allows us to consider this parable alongside other stories that use food to teach us about God. The feeding of the 5,000, or Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples. These are stories in which the work and the power of God are expressed with and by food. Because God's love, God's grace is sustenance. It is nourishment. It is bread for the hungry. And so let's not forget that Jesus in this parable compares the kingdom of God to this plant that is food. Okay? Okay, but that's not all that this plant is. Not at all. It's the mustard seed, and the mustard plant is not just food. Easily forgotten in our modern day is that mustard was understood as medicine in the time of Jesus. It was a medicinal plant. Now, it is hard for us to think about plants in the garden this way because, in our time, we are used to medicine being a pill from a plastic bottle or a shot through a syringe or some sticky pink syrup that we give to a toddler when they have a fever. And all this stuff, of course, is developed in a lab somewhere by people in white coats. But throughout almost all of human history, medicine was plants that people cultivated carefully through close observation. Communities accumulated wisdom across generations that certain plants could be used in certain ways to help with certain things. And mustard was one of these plants. Okay. You may have heard of this guy Pliny the Elder, famous old Roman guy. He was advisor to Emperor Vespasian. Pliny was the preeminent scholar, historian, botanist, jack of all trades, I guess, in the Roman Empire at the time when the Gospel of Matthew was being written, about 40 to 50 years after the death of Jesus. And old Pliny, he actually wrote, he wrote about everything under the sun, and he wrote about the medicinal uses of mustard in one of his great masterworks. And here is a quote from Pliny the Elder. "Mustard is extremely beneficial for the health. Treatment of snake and scorpion bites," which I just love the thought of that. You get bit by a snake, squirt a little mustard on it, right? But not just that, toothache, indigestion, asthma, epilepsy, constipation, dropsy, lethargy, leprous sores, and other illnesses. Thank you, Pliny. Friends, this was the medical expertise of the day. And so when Jesus teaches people that the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed that grows into a mustard plant, he is saying that God's kingdom is not only a small thing that grows into something that is much greater than what you see today, but the thing that's growing is medicine. God's kingdom is a thing that helps people heal, helps people be well, and it is getting bigger. If you feel like there's not much help in the world, not much healing at all, maybe only the tiniest little bit, Jesus says that this tiny little bit of help and healing can grow into something much, much bigger. Now there's one more purpose, one more outcome of the mustard plant's impressive growth that Jesus' parable points out. Now, interesting, everything that I've discussed, the uses of the mustard plant, right? Everything up to this point is this stuff that I've just named is not named in the parable, right? Jesus doesn't actually say anything about harvesting the mustard plant when he tells this story. The harvest is insinuated because the person planted the seed and intentionally grew the plant in his field. So we assume that the plant or part of it or the seeds of it will be harvested. But the parable does explicitly name one additional purpose or benefit of the plant's growth that is separate even from the harvest. And what is that? What does Jesus say in this parable the mustard plant is good for, right? If you ask that to Jesus' original audience, what is the mustard plant good for? They would have already known that it's good for food and that it's good for medicine. But the parable points out something else as well. And it says that when the seed has been sown and the plant has grown, it becomes bigger and stronger until it is so big that the birds of the air can make their nests in it. Because this tiny, tiny seed was planted in the soil, it has grown into something that provides shelter, protection, a resting place, a home to other living creatures. It's kind of profound that this parable highlights the value of the plant not just to people, to human beings, but to creation as a whole, including specifically birds, right? The birds get a place to make their nest, right? And so this plant grows and grows and grows, and it thereby increases not only its physical size, but also its capacity, its ability to play a role in the care and provision for other living things. And in that, we see that the maturity of the plant is actually not evaluated by how big it has gotten, but on what it can do because it has grown. Now it is big enough to host. It is strong enough to help. Jesus says that God's kingdom is here. It is real. It is small. And it is growing. It is growing as nourishment, food for the hungry, sustenance for you and me. This is God's will, you see, that those who hunger be fed. The kingdom is also growing as medicine, as healing and restoration for suffering bodies and souls. This is God's will, that the burdened and the broken be made well. And the kingdom is growing as shelter, as sanctuary, that neighbors in creation would be welcomed and would be safe. You and I are invited to trust that these things are true, stunning as they are to contemplate, that the kingdom is real. The kingdom is nourishment. The kingdom is healing. The kingdom is shelter, right? And the kingdom is true. It's small, but getting big. It would be a big thing to believe in this thing that we are invited to believe. And you may have days when you feel that your faith just ain't big enough to believe it. Then again, I have it on good authority to say, it's okay to start small. Amen.